The problem with most conquests is that they only breed more wars and violence, and each time an empire expands its borders, new enemies are waiting further afield. Such was the case in the middle of the 7th century when the Umayyad Caliphate expanded into the South Caucasus region, only to become enemies with the Turkic Khazar Khanate immediately. Even though the Umayyads were replaced by the Abbasids soon after, the conflicts between the Arabs and Khazars continued for 150 years. In this video, we will talk about the Arab-Khazar wars, many battles and raids that happened during them, as well as the diplomatic situation involving the Kievan Rus, Volga Bulgars, Eastern Romans and many others, as we describe the rise and fall of the Khazar Khanate. This week, our YouTube members and patrons will be watching the next installment in our series on the Second Punic War, as we cover the Battle of Trebia, the first direct engagement of the war between the Romans and the Carthaginians. The support of our YouTube members and patrons allows us to continue releasing these free videos without worrying about the unstable YouTube ad revenue and lets us be more choosy in terms of our sponsors. You can join their ranks via the links in the description and get access to 2 weekly exclusive videos and more than 150 right now, including the series on the Pacific War, Fall of Sparta, First Punic War, Italian Reunification Wars, Albigensian Crusade, History of Prussia, Biography of Sulla, Reconquista, World War II North African Campaign, Persian Wars, and much more. Thanks for your kind support. Much has been written of the conflicts between the Eastern Roman Empire and its Asian rival powers, the Sassanid Empire of Persia and the Arab Caliphates. But throughout nearly the whole of these long struggles, a third major power lay to the north, less well remembered but a vital part of the history of Europe and Asia both. This was the Khazar Khaganate, a Turkic kingdom that never fully abandoned its nomadic origins, even as it established a wealthy, sophisticated kingdom, recognized as an important regional power by its settled neighbors, and afforded all the respect of a fellow empire. The earliest recorded entrance of the Khazars into European history is possibly as part of the Hunnic Empire of Attila, with a tribe referred to by Roman diplomat and chronicler Priscius as the Akatzias, who were led by a chief called Caridach, listed among Attila's vassals in 448. The Romans approached Caridach with bribes as part of an effort to undermine Attila's confederation, but these efforts failed, with Caridach keeping the bribe but spurning Roman efforts to goad him into rebellion. Though the connection of these Akatzias to the later Khazars is disputed and far from definite, a later Arab account of the Khazar Khaganate does detail the social division between so-called Ak-Khazar and Kara-Khazar, or white and black Khazars, seemingly a division of social class, with the Ak-Khazar fitting the Akatzia name given by a diplomat who would only have been dealing with the elites and leadership. Whether the Khazars were indeed part of Attila's confederation, or the Akatziri an unrelated Hunnic tribe, concrete evidence of their presence and power would emerge with the 6th century reign of Sassanid Shahenshah Khosrow Anushirvan, who recorded victories against them and built fortifications to ward off their raids, but also married a Khazar bride in a short-lived bid for alliance. The Western Turkic Khaganate, or Gökturks, took the place of Attila's Hunnic Empire between the mid-6th and mid-7th centuries, but even while subordinate to this new power, the Khazars loomed larger than before in accounts of the era, though the use of Khazar by many Roman sources to refer to the Turkic Khaganate as a whole makes some accounts difficult to attribute properly. Still, it is clear that alongside raids into Georgia and Armenia, Khazar warriors made their way onto many battlefields, often as allies or mercenaries fighting for the Eastern Romans, but at other times battling against them as fierce foes. In 627, while the Prophet Muhammad was leading the first Muslims and the warriors of Medina against Mecca, an alliance between the Western Khagan Tongyapku and Rome was formed, with his vassal Khazar horsemen playing a major role in Emperor Heraclius' campaign against Persia. This formed the beginnings of a partnership that would hold largely intact through the coming century of war with the Caliphate that both powers would endure. The actions of the Khazars during this last Byzantine-Sassanid war would also highlight how quickly their nation was taking up the trappings of their more settled neighbours. Upon capturing the city of Tbilisi from the Sassanids, the Khazar Khan is recorded to have sent envoys to examine the work of the city's artists and craftsmen, with the recorded techniques and resettled talent proving in the long term a richer prize than plunder from the city's sacking. While this may instead refer to Tongyabgu, as previously mentioned, the growing wealth and production base of the Khazars is also demonstrated by its armies, with consistent descriptions of well-armoured Khazar horsemen setting them apart from the nomadic light cavalry armies of their neighbours. Unfortunately, the collapse of the Sassanids would bring a new enemy to the Khazars' doorstep barely a decade later. The explosive period of Islamic expansion under Caliph Umar and the legendary general Khalid ibn al-Walid coincided with a period of similar turmoil and transformation in the steppes, with the Gökturks losing control of their western vassals as a result of their subjugation by Tang China, even as Arab armies were first reaching the Caucasus. The Khazars would thus quickly find themselves thrust into a conflict on multiple fronts, sucked into the power vacuum left by their diminished former overlord. 642 would be a pivotal year on both fronts, and see the Khazars meet both victory and defeat. Abd al-Rahman ibn Rabia led the first Arab attacks out of recently conquered Byzantine Syria and Persian Mesopotamia into the Caucasus Mountains, swiftly seizing Derbent and the extensive Sassanid fortifications guarding the route along the Caspian coast, called Bab al-Abwab, or the Gate of Gates, by the Arabs. Political power in the region was in a state of flux, as the empires that had long contested it reeled from their recent defeats. Armenia and Georgia seem to have been functionally independent at the time, not coming under formal Arab suzerainty for several more years, while the Dagestan region of the North Caucasus still hosted Persian governors left behind by the Sassanids, who were now paying their tribute to the Khazar Khagan. The Arab invasion would initially progress without resistance. Though it lacked the numbers to firmly establish lasting Arab control in the Caucasus, the army did win a pledge of allegiance from Derbent's governor, Shahbaraz, who negotiated to have his and his garrison's military service against the Khazars accepted as the city's tribute in place of the customary jizya tax. Unsatisfied with this victory, Abd al-Rahman made it his goal to cross the river Aras and capture Balanjar, the nearest city under direct Khazar rule. Little is recorded of his first attempt during the reign of Umar, though it seems no significant battle was fought. Ignoring a rather fanciful claim credited to Abd al-Rahman's own brother that angels protected him from the Khazars' attacks, it appears the defending forces chose to fortify themselves within Balanjar upon his approach, with the overextended commander turning back with his plunder rather than risking a long siege with so much unfriendly territory behind him. Still, the lack of a major Khazar response to this first attack led him to make repeated incursions north of Derbent over the next decade, raiding with near impunity. The reason the Khazars offered so little resistance against these initial Arab incursions was likely because they were tied up dealing with another rival in the west, the Bulgars of the Volga River, who had emerged as the other major competitor in the steppe power vacuum. Though a precise chronology is harder to establish on the steppes, the Khazar-Bulgar showdown probably occurred simultaneously with the first Arab invasion, with 642 being the year often given for the Bulgar defeat at Khazar hands. In the aftermath of the Khazar victory, a large exodus of Bulgars migrated westward, eventually establishing the Khanate and later the Kingdom of Bulgaria. Those remaining in so-called Volga Bulgaria paid a steep tribute to the victors and harboured a lasting resentment towards their Khazar overlords over the following 2 centuries. While the Volga Bulgars would play a further role in the Caliphate and Khanate's rivalry in the future, it was back in Balanjar that the first major showdown of the two powers would occur a decade later in 652, during the reign of Caliph Uthman. Returning after an absence from the Caucasus theatre to put down a rebellion in Kufa, Abd al-Rahman, together with his brother Salman, again brought a sizable army into Khazar territory, driving for the Khazar capital of Balanjar. Though records are scant, this campaign seems to have had conquest and expansion as its goal, rather than simple raiding, with Armenia and Georgia being brought under Arab control by the Syrian forces of future Caliph Muawiyah between 645 and 646. Moreover, with the last Sassanid Shahenshah, Yazdegerd, having perished in 651, the Caliphate possessed a far more secure base of power to expand from, and ballistae of various sizes accompanied the army. This time, however, the Khazars would not be content to hide behind Balanjar's walls. Resisting strongly with ballistae of their own, the Khazars also made use of sorties to enjoy a degree of initiative and mobility despite the state of siege. The exact timeline and length of the siege are unknown, but the contest would be decided in a pitched battle rather than the attrition of a long siege. The first clash was an ambush, with a party of Muslims being set upon by hidden Khazar archers outside the city walls. This unusual achievement of ambushing a besieging enemy demonstrated that Abd al-Rahman lacked the numbers to properly encircle and entrap Khazar defenders, or feared to spread his besieging army too thin. Though only a minor victory, it emboldened the Khazars to undertake repeated hit-and-run attacks over the following days, with the full force of the defenders surging out on the final day of battle to join a newly arriving relief army of horsemen. Attempting to rally his forces against this combined attack, Abd al-Rahman perished early in the battle, though to his army's credit this did not bring about a rout. His brother Salman took up the fallen standard alongside Abu Hurayya ibn al-Dosi, a companion of Muhammad much respected for his photographic memory, who had helped to record and transmit the Quran. This allowed much of the army to carry out a fighting retreat past Derbent to the safety of modern Baku. However, while complete disaster was averted, the Khazars had decisively won the day, inflicting terrible casualties and keeping the body of Abd al-Rahman as a trophy, with the Arab chroniclers even claiming it was used as a talisman to summon rain for decades to follow. After this crushing defeat, the two powers would have relative peace for nearly half a century, though the threat posed by the Khazars would still influence the Caliphate greatly. It is due largely to the Khazar menace that the lands of Armenia, Georgia and Caucasian Albania were ruled so indirectly. In return for holding the line against the northern nomads, these lands were allowed to keep their Christian nobility and power structures intact, despite their geographic closeness to the Umayyad Caliphate's Syrian core. They were not always successful in this. While the Caliphate was split apart by the Second Fitna, a Khazar invasion under the Khagan Busir would lay waste to these Caucasian client kingdoms in 685, claiming the life of Armenia's ruler Grigor Mamikonian. However, the victorious Khazars made no effort to hold any territory south of Derbent, or push on into Syria or Persia. The Khazars' modest expansion during this era was mostly westward, subduing groups such as the Alans and Magyars, but some of their most profitable victories would not come on the battlefield, but from playing the cutthroat game of Eastern Roman politics. In 698, the Khazars took in the deposed and exiled Emperor Justinian II, and arranged his marriage to Khagan Busir's sister, who, after her wedding, became known by the Christian name of Theodora. From intervening in Justinian's repeated loss and seizure of power, the Khazars would twice extort heavy tributes from Constantinople, and even take control of the Crimean Peninsula without risking a man on the battlefield. The first of these came in the form of an enormous bribe from Justinian's usurper Tiberius III to remain neutral and deny Justinian the army the Khazars had promised him. Years later, after Justinian's successful return to power with Bulgar rather than Khazar aid, the paranoid tyrant's expedition against his perceived enemies in Crimea drove the region's governor Bardanes to give his fealty to Khagan Busir for protection. Finally, when Bardanes was declared emperor in absentia by rebels against Justinian's rule, Busir collected a second ransom, simply to release the newly declared emperor to his supporters. Evidently, the promise of gold and territory clearly outweighed any loyalty Busir felt for his brother-in-law. Though the Romans and Khazars would remain loosely allied through most of this period, the Steppe Empire would prove as adept as the Caliphate in taking advantage of Constantinople's frequent civil strife, and also profited from its periodic bouts of persecution by accepting talented Jewish and heterodox Christian exiles into their relative haven of religious neutrality. Though the Khazar ruling class still held to their shamanic practices, missionaries, a policy of trade and immigration, allowed large Christian, Jewish and Muslim communities to thrive within the Khazar realm. Soon this period of peace came to an end. and the Khazars, stronger than ever, began to pose a serious threat to the Umayyad Caliphate. Between 707 and 712, Derbent and the Gate of Gates would change hands several times, with the Caliphate unable to defend it effectively, being engaged in conquests from Hispania to the Tarim Basin. This weak response only encouraged further Khazar attacks. In 717, an invasion of Caucasian Albania would follow, narrowly repulsed by the Muslims in a Pyrrhic victory. This was followed up in 721 with an invasion of a 30,000-strong Khazar army into Armenia, the beginning of what is called the Second Arab-Khazar War. With the Arab armies still weakened from the recent defeat at Constantinople, the Khazars, under a leader called Bajik, won a decisive victory, trampling over the army of Thubayt al-Narani in the Battle of Marj al-Hajara and sending the survivors fleeing to Syria. With the enemy dangerously close to the Umayyad core, a second army was assembled in 722 under the newly appointed governor of Armenia, Jarrah ibn Abdullah al-Hakami, and sent to dislodge the Khazars from their new conquests. Were the Arabs unable to stop the Khazar horde at this critical junction, a Khazar invasion of Syria could have followed, threatening to splinter the Umayyad Caliphate entirely. With the stakes high and their armies boasting similar strength, both Jarrah and Bajik approached the coming showdown with caution, the Khazars withdrawing close to the still Arab-held Gate of Gates to avoid fighting in hostile territory and allow easier reinforcement. Jarrah pursued slowly, gathering support from local tribes and nobles as he travelled, rather than rushing to a premature engagement. He would seize the advantage with a shrewd tactical decision after a morning crossing of the Kur River, a short distance from where the Khazars were encamped. Having discovered that one of the tribal leaders he had rallied was loyal to the Khazars, or at least hedging his bets by reporting his movements to the enemy, he ordered his army to make camp, declaring they would rest and reinforce for several days before pressing the attack. When night fell, however, he changed his orders, marching out immediately. As he suspected, the Khazars had been informed of his false intention to wait in place, and he was able to bypass his unprepared enemy to the security of Derbent without a battle, adding its garrison to his forces. The following day he flipped the script by continuing north into Khazar territory, destructively raiding and plundering as he went, and forcing what had just the previous day been an invading horde to make a frantic defense of its own lands. Though little detail remains of the engagement itself, this confusion and forced haste likely worked to Jarrah's advantage, and when Bajik's army caught it several days later, the Muslims defeated it utterly, seizing forts and plunder and pushing on to Balanjar, where their predecessors had been driven back some 70 years prior. Here, another fierce defense was mounted. Though the city's fortifications had fallen into disrepair, hundreds of wagons were drawn in a defensive circle on the high ground around still-standing towers, and arrows were showered on the advancing Arabs by the thousands until they were said to darken the sun. But with their morale bolstered by recent victory and Jarrah's speeches, the Muslim warriors braved the hail of arrows to sever the ropes connecting the wagons, sending them crashing down the hill or lighting them ablaze, finally forcing their way into the city after a day's heavy fighting and embarking on a slaughter of much of its population. From having so recently been poised to invade Syria itself, the Khazars' fortunes had been swiftly and shockingly reversed. And though Jarrah would not remain long in Dagestan, he would return with vast plunder and relocate entire towns worth of captives into the lands of the Caliphate. A lull in the fighting would follow, as the Khazars recovered, and the overstretched Arabs faced rebellion at home and defeat in far-off Transoxiana. But the Second Arab-Khazar War was still far from over. Even the greatest victories could often be short-lived, especially in a time of turmoil and overextension for the Caliphate. With this victory over the Khazars coinciding with such pivotal clashes as the Battle of Toulouse in France and the Day of Thirst in Transoxiana, the army that had beaten the Khazars back could not remain long in hostile territory without reinforcements. Although Al-Jarrah sent requests to the Caliph for additional forces to follow up on the victory, no such support would be forthcoming. Though damaged, the Khazar army remained intact, mobile and threatening, and while a smaller foray by Al-Jarrah in 724 brought the city of Tiflis temporarily under the Caliphate's control, A lack of sufficient support left the opportunity created by his initial victories to be largely squandered. Al-Jarrah would not long keep his governorship either, despite his great successes and his growing renown among the soldiers of the Caliphate. The ascension of the new Caliph, Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, in 725 saw Al-Jarrah replaced by the Caliph's brother Maslama, the general who had years ago led the first Umayyad invasion of Khazar territory and later the failed siege of Constantinople. For all his experience as a commander, Maslama would prove a rather poor administrator and a worse planner. More interested in the wealth of Anatolia than the looming threat of the Khazars, he continued launching raids and attacks against the Byzantines in the following years, rather than preparing for the defense of the Caucasus or preemptively attacking the greater threat to the north. Thus, from 725 to 728, the Khazars were allowed to rebuild their strength unchallenged, while the Muslims were weakened by conflict in Anatolia and on more numerous distant fronts, allowing the Khaganate to freely take the offensive once more when the second phase of the war began. The Khazars again marched to the Caucasus mountain passes in mid-728, again under the capable leadership of Bajik. Bajik's somewhat debated identity provides an opportunity to explore some of the internal structure of the Khazar Khaganate, as well as the challenges facing historical studies of their empire. As mentioned in the previous chapter, he was described as the Khagan's son by Arab chroniclers of the time, though it seems that at this point in the Khazar Khaganate's evolution from a nomadic federation to a settled empire, the position of the Khagan was growing into an increasingly ceremonial role. The more complete accounts of later Arab writers who travelled extensively in Khazar domains describe a dual monarchy system, with ceremonial and spiritual leadership in the hands of the Khagan, while military matters and civil administration was handled by the Bek, a powerful military and rulership position not strictly tied to heredity. The exact timeline of this dual monarchy's development is unclear, and may well not have existed in the same form during Bajik's time. Written Khazar sources are very lacking, and the most thorough accounts describing the Khazar court and politics come from Arab travellers such as Ibn Fadlan in the 10th century, well after the end of the war in question. Nevertheless, it is likely that Bajik was not the Khagan's son, but rather the Bek, based on his commanding role in the two invasions, with the misattribution of his role stemming from Arab chroniclers much less familiar with the Khaganate's internal workings than their later successors. Regardless of the blurry timelines and politics, the Khaganate's rematch against the Caliphate had begun, and Bajik's fellow royal Maslama would rise to the challenge. Unfortunately for all his skill, Maslama was a general accustomed to leading raids and conquests, and his unfamiliarity with defense and administration would be on full display in his response to the Khazar invasion. Several failures were evident in his preparations for the Khazar attack. While he raised a powerful army from the Caliphate's core regions of Syria and Iraq, he failed to make inroads with and properly mobilize the local Armenian nobility and their forces. In neglecting the resources placed at his disposal as governor, and instead taking on the brunt of the fighting with loyal Arab troops, he squandered soldiers who might have been better mobilized to other collapsing fronts, such as Transoxiana. Attempting to seize the initiative in the conflict, Maslama tried to stem the invasion by meeting the Khazars in open battle in the mountain passes of the Central Caucasus, attempting to block them from crossing from Alania into present-day Georgia. In September 728, a nearly month-long protracted battle under a downpour of heavy rain ensued. Ultimately, this battle was recorded as a victory in Arab chronicles, though it seemed to have been a victory only in the narrow sense that Arab forces were the last to remain on that particular field of battle. This did not end the Khazar invasion. During this month of standoffs and skirmishing, significant Khazar forces bypassed his army by other routes to enter the Caucasus unmolested. Even Maslama's own main force suffered a surprise attack in the rear by the same army they had supposedly defeated as they withdrew from the passes back into northern Georgia, with much of its baggage train and the army's pay looted and carried off by Khazar riders, mirroring Maslama's earlier defeats at Bulgar hands outside Constantinople. It is entirely possible that, far from representing a defeat, Bajik's intention had simply been to keep Maslama's army immobilized from the start. For the rest of the year, the Khazars raided and ransacked throughout the Caucasus, leading to Maslama's removal from governorship the following year, with al-Jarrah being returned to command. However, the hero of Balanjar would not be taking victory so easily a second time. With the beginning of the campaigning season of 730, he made an attempt to repeat the strategy behind his previous success, marching north to again invade Khazar territory near Tiflis, in hopes of forcing them to do battle on his terms, rather than chasing their mobile raiding bands around the Caucasus. This time, however, Bajik ignored the challenge. Instead, he moved his forces south, splitting them into two armies to take both Caucasus mountain passes and limit al-Jarrah's ability to block them. At this point, both al-Jarrah and Bajik were taking the offensive and effectively challenging the other to pursue them, and it was al-Jarrah who turned back first, forced to depart the Khaganate without any significant gains to show for his months of campaigning. Returning to defend his lands, al-Jarrah first chased the smaller of the two Khazar armies, a diversionary force under a general named Tharmak, that was threatening the entire region of Aran. Though the siege was lifted ahead of the Arabs' arrival and the city was saved, the diversion allowed Bajik's larger army to make for a far greater prize, the rich city of Ardabil, the regional capital and staging ground for al-Jarrah's offensive. With the families of a large portion of their soldiers staying within the city's walls, the Arabs had little choice but to attempt to break the siege, despite now being outnumbered after Tharmak's force escaped to rejoin Bajik's. Despite the advantages in numbers and mobility enjoyed by the Khazars, al-Jarrah did command a powerful force, close to 20,000, when joined with the defenders of Ardabil, and both his personal renown and the presence of so many soldiers' families within the besieged city lent morale to his forces. In December of 730, this would allow them to hold out through 3 days of heavy fighting against the well-armoured and equipped Khazar cavalry. However, by the third day, his forces began to be overrun and overwhelmed. The local non-Muslim auxiliary forces in his army, or Mawali, had begun to desert in large numbers, seeing the battle as unwinnable. Those that remained behind, including both al-Jarrah himself and much of the population of conquered Ardabil, were put to the sword by the victorious and vengeful Khazars. As the rest of the winter drew on, both terror and outrage spread swiftly across the heartlands of the Caliphate. Terror at the army now poised to push deeper into Syria or Iraq when the winter lifted, and outrage at the killing and humiliation of the well-loved general whose head had been affixed to Bajik's throne in cruel mockery. Maslama was again given command of the deteriorating situation, though he would have little time to prepare an army before the Khazars marched again in spring. Early the following year, Bajik and his army marched on Mosul, smaller bands of raiders breaking off from the main force as it put the city under siege. Maslama's army was still a month or so away from battle readiness. Concerned, Caliph Hisham deployed a commander named Sa'id ibn Amir al-Harashi with an advance force to check the raiders while Maslama finished mustering his army. A proud general stung by his previous failure, Maslama had been hungrily awaiting an opportunity to avenge al-Jarrah and win the glory of defending the Caliphate. So it was not with relief but outrage that he reacted to the shocking, unexpected news that reached him from Mosul. Sa'id ibn Amir's outnumbered advance force had won a total victory and driven the Khazars to flee back across the Caucasus. This was not an outcome anyone had expected. Sa'id had not been intended to challenge Bajik's main force besieging Mosul, but the commander had found an opportunity too rare to pass up upon reaching the region. Not expecting to be challenged by another army so quickly after their crushing victory at Ardabil, Bajik's army had divided into many unprepared raiding bands. Whether due to overconfidence or the tribally divided Khazar army breaking down in the presence of easy loot and the absence of an obvious threat, no organized readiness to regroup in the face of the attack materialized when Sa'id began attacking and driving off these forces piecemeal. Sa'id also managed to recruit many stragglers and deserters from al-Jarrah's defeated army, promising handsome payments and a chance to avenge their fallen general. After a few smaller victories against the raiding forces, he launched a surprise night attack on the diminished Khazar army maintaining the siege of Mosul, managing to find and slay Bajik and drive his splintered army into full retreat. In this, he succeeded where Maslama and al-Jarrah had both failed, with far greater forces to command. Initially, Maslama felt so cheated and outraged that he had the victorious Said imprisoned on charges of insubordination, until the Caliph intervened to free him and reward him. Ultimately, this would set the pattern for the remaining 7 years of the Second Arab-Khazar War, promising offensives but few conclusive victories, and little territory changing hands in lasting fashion. The defeat at Mosul would leave the Khazars on the defensive for the rest of the war, with Maslama invading in late 731. He managed to capture Balanjar once more, but was unable to leave a permanent garrison behind, with the Caliphate so overstretched. However, while territorially indecisive, the war would have a lasting impact in the Caucasus, with the appointment of the future Caliph Marwan ibn Muhammad as governor in Maslama's place in 732. Recognizing the failures of his predecessors, Marwan worked hard to raise up reliable local allies in the region in a two-pronged effort. In Caucasian Iberia, a region of fierce resistance to both Khazar and Arab domination, his army descended like a hammer to crush and replace the independence-minded nobles. Conversely, he courted the Qaisi tribal confederation and elevated the Bagratuni dynasty of Armenia, a house that would later produce legendary kings and queens such as David the Builder and Tamar of Georgia, and hold power in the Caucasus until the 19th century. In doing this, Marwan established powerful proxies without the need for bloodshed, leaving the Caucasus organized under loyal hands and ready to repulse further invasion. Despite the tide of the war turning against them, this was a time of growth and change for the Khazars as well. As Marwan played politics in Armenia, the Khazars worked at solidifying the Byzantine alliance, with Eastern Roman Emperor Leo marrying his son, the future Emperor Constantine V, to Kagan Bihar's daughter Zizak in 732, speaking to both strengthening ties and the Khaganate's growing legitimacy as a great power in the region. The war finally ended in 737, with the Khazars suing for peace after another Arab invasion commanded by Marwan. Though the capable Umayyad prince had scored some minor victories, peace seems to have followed more from the mutual exhaustion of the two powers and the numerous other problems facing the Caliphate than representing any sort of grand victory. As terms of peace, the Khagan agreed on the conversion of his court and nation to Islam. Though if any sort of conversion took place beyond brief lip service, it was short-lived, and the matter was swiftly forgotten. It is likely that Caliph Hisham was eager to make peace as well, and may have simply set the terms to save face rather than out of an expectation they would be followed through. No attempt was made to enforce the terms after the Khagan reneged. In any case, the Umayyads would soon have far greater internal threats to face, including the once loyal Yamani Confederation, who were angered by the favoritism Marwan showed to their longtime rivals the Qaisi. With the Yamani marching into the rebel ranks, the Abbasid revolution would topple and all but expunge the Umayyad dynasty 2 decades after the Second Arab-Khazar War's end. Up to this point, communities following all 3 of the Abrahamic religions had prospered within the religiously tolerant shamanistic Khaganate. Moreover, they had developed ties with both the Islamic Caliphate and the Christian Byzantine Empire, with prosperous trade in furs, amber, wine and many other goods growing more lucrative than the raiding and pillaging that had once filled Khazar coffers. It would not have been surprising for the Khaganate to eventually adopt either Islam or Christianity to further enhance these ties, as so many other tribal or nomadic nations on the frontiers of the great empires already had or would in the future. Along the coasts of India and Africa, where Arab merchants dealt, Islam spread and sultanates rose. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire's sphere of influence, raiders and rivals from the Bulgars to the Kievan Rus would eventually embrace Christianity to open new avenues of trade and diplomacy with the ailing but still prosperous empire of Constantine. But in one of the most debated and controversial periods of Khazar history, the Khaganate did neither, taking a third option, Judaism. Whether the Khazars as a people broadly embraced Judaism or simply a sizable portion of the ruling elite is debated, with some questioning whether the conversion ever occurred at all. But references to the Khazars as a Jewish kingdom, one of the very few independent and powerful Jewish states since the fall of the Jewish Himyarite kingdom of Yemen, begin as early as the late 8th century. Possible reasons for this are numerous. Politically, the conversion would have represented a powerful declaration of independence by the Khazars, and allowed relations to be maintained with both the Byzantines and Abbasids without firmly picking a side or being subservient to either. Sporadic periods of increased hostility to Jews in both the Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate had driven Jewish exiles to the Khazars for decades, and the conversion of the Khazars also coincides closely with the start of the Karaite schism among the Jews of the Middle East in the 760s. The Karaites, followers of the would-be exilarch Anan ben David, who reject the oral law of the Talmud and the rabbis in favor of the Hebrew Bible alone, spread their faith throughout the Caliphate and beyond, despite the rejection of their leader by the traditional Jewish authorities of the time, with some historians drawing a possible link between the proselytizing of the early Karaites and the conversion of the Khazars. Lastly, the mantle of the Kingdom of Israel represented a legacy significant to all the Abrahamic faiths, a legacy the Khazars made efforts to connect themselves to, with the dual monarchy of the later Khazar Empire possibly influenced by the shared power of the old Israelite kingdom's monarchy and hereditary priesthood. All these and other theories remain hotly debated, with a lack of surviving Khazar accounts making consensus difficult, but the prominence of Judaism among at least the Khazar elite is well supported. No further large-scale wars between the Khazars and Caliphs would occur during the reign of the Abbasid Caliphs, whose revolution toppled the Umayyads shortly after. However, the peace forged between the Caliphate and Khazar Khaganate would not bring either empire any lasting security, and they would soon find themselves facing shared new threats, sometimes necessitating unlikely alliances even as their old rivalry simmered. Initially, the Scandinavian rulers of the early Rus had been important trading partners for the commerce-focused Khazar Khaganate, which throughout most of the 9th century had held Kiev as a regional capital, from which tributes were extracted from East Slavic nations. Though the antagonistic Volga Bulgars lay between the Rus and the flourishing Khazar capital of Ityl, Rus traders would take a circuitous route down the Dnieper into the Black Sea, making stops to trade in Cherson in the Crimean Peninsula before continuing up the Don River to Ityl. However, towards the end of the 9th century, a number of factors began to disrupt this arrangement. With the Caliphate no longer providing a clear shared enemy, the long-standing uneasy alliance between the Khazars and Byzantium began to break down, and the Byzantines began seeking other alliances in the steppes to weaken the Khazars and keep any single polity from growing to be a potential threat. In the 880s, the Alans and other groups backed by the Byzantines would chip away at Khazar power, simultaneous with renewed attacks by the Pechenegs, a nomadic people the Khazars had bloodied and driven westwards but never truly subjugated. Despite the Rus having made a devastating raid on Constantinople only a few short decades ago in 860, they would prove an ideal partner and proxy for the Byzantines. Through diplomacy and monetary support, the Eastern Roman Empire began to supplant Khazar influence in the Rus lands with Greek, with the same Greek historian who detailed the savage Varangian assault on Constantinople in 860 remarking favourably on the rapid adoption of Christianity in their lands by 867. Though the Khazars weathered most of these attacks, this period would see them lose the city of Kiev and lordship over most of the Eastern Slavs to the Varangian leaders Rurik and Oleg, marking the foundation of the Kievan Rus, an occasion that would have a momentous impact on centuries of history to follow. Following the takeover of Kiev and its establishment as a new capital, Slavic vassals of the Scandinavian Rus would engage in shipbuilding as a form of tribute, delivering to their overlords in Kiev the vessels that would bring both their merchants to Ityl and their raiders to Constantinople and the Caspian, with the great river fleets of the Rus boasting more than 2,000 ships by the accounts of Byzantine chronicles. Meanwhile, on the Khazars' southern border, the slow splintering of the Caliphate and the emergence of newly independent Muslim principalities made their uneasy truce with the Caliph in Baghdad less of a guarantee for peace in the region. And 912 would see a 10,000-strong Muslim army from the newly independent region of Shirvan defeated near today's Akusha by Khazar forces in a failed invasion attempt. The first stirring of conflict that would involve the Rus with both the Khazars and Caliphate occurred the following year in 913, when a great fleet of Rus ships portaged into the Volga River. Promising half their plunder to the Khazar Khagan, they were granted safe passage into the Caspian Sea, possibly an act of retribution by the Khazar Khagan for Ibn al-Haytham's recent provocation, and set to ravage and plunder the wealthy Tabaristan and Shirvan regions, with primary sources describing a fleet of 500 ships, each manned by 100 people. Though these numbers were almost certainly inflated, this nevertheless represents an enormous incursion that the merchants and fishermen of the region were quite unprepared for. After numerous landings to capture plunder and slaves along the southern Caspian coast, an attempt at resistance was undertaken by Ali ibn al-Haytham as the fleet approached his capital of Baku. While the Rus had anchored at a small chain of islands close to Baku's shore, Ibn al-Haytham mobilized his forces along with thousands of enraged local volunteers, pressing whatever small fishing boats and merchant ships they could lay their hands on into service to ferry the ragtag Muslim army across the water. However, despite their numbers, they were out of their element on the water, and their makeshift navy was hopelessly outclassed by the superior ships of the Rus. Though some of the boats made it to landfall on the islands, they made little ground against the Rus, who killed many in close quarters fighting on the beach, and once the ships of the Rus took to the water, retreat became an impossibility. The disorganized attack soon unraveled, with simultaneous fighting on the islands and boarding attacks between ships on the Caspian, ending with the Shirvani force broken and thousands dead, slain by Kievan warriors, or drowning as overloaded civilian craft overturned, or outmatched soldiers threw themselves into the water to escape the merciless boarding parties. Baku would be plundered, with this second defeat and humiliation for Ibn al-Haytham playing a role in his overthrow and the end of his dynasty a few years later. News of the attacks spread quickly, sparking outrage not just in the Caliphate but among the large Muslim populations of the Khazar Khaganate, who petitioned their ruler for permission to attack the returning Rus as they made their way back home through the Volga, and avenge the killings in Persia. By this point, the military strength of the Khaganate no longer stemmed entirely from the nomadic Khazar horsemen that had founded it, and with Muslim mercenaries of Khorasani origin providing much of its strength, and even providing the Khagan's royal guard, the Khagan chose to break his deal to the Rus and acquiesce in the name of stability. Thus, an army of 15,000, formed of both Muslims and some of Itil's Christians, blocked the raiders' return journey near Itil, with the Rus landing their vessels and drawing up battle lines. While the Rus were skilled warriors and already battle-tested after their victories on the Caspian, the Khazar Muslims had a significant cavalry force, an advantage neither the Rus nor the vanquished defenders of Baku had boasted. The fighting raged for 3 days, with no quarter given, leading to the routing and massacre of the Rus raiding force, with whatever remnants of the broken army who escaped the battle proving easy pickings for other nomadic peoples between Itil and Kiev before they could reach the safety of home. Despite this disaster, the strength of the Rus was far from broken. This breakdown in relations closed the rivers to the Rus in the following years, but also denied the Khazars much of the profitable trade the Rus had brought to their markets, with the Volga Bulgars eclipsing them as the Varangians' main trading partner. In addition, a brief war between the Rus and Khazars soon saw even more Khazar tributaries absorbed into the Kievan fold. The most complete single source detailing the political and cultural situations of the steppes and the Rus comes from the travels of Ahmad ibn Fadlan in 921, a Muslim traveller and Islamic legal scholar dispatched to the court of Volga Bulgaria by the Caliphate to provide guidance after their recent conversion to Islam. In exchange for their conversion, the Caliphate agreed to fund the construction of a fortress, a deal in which the Bulgars intended to wrest more independence from their overlords, and the Caliphate hoped to get a powerful Muslim ally and weaken their old northern rival. Ibn Fadlan's account still shows the Khazars as the region's dominant power. It describes at length the richness and splendour of the Khazar capital of Itil and the many palaces of the Khagan and his harem, but definite cracks begin to show. Beginning his travels by departing Samanid-ruled Khorasan with a massive trade caravan of 5,000 people, Ibn Fadlan first travelled through the lands of the Oghuz Turks. In one encounter that demonstrates the fragile nature of Khazar power in the region, an Oghuz tribe, believing Ibn Fadlan's gifts were meant for their nominal overlord, the Khagan, held Ibn Fadlan and his caravan hostage for several days. Lively debates ensued among the tribe as various leaders argued on whether to have the travellers either killed and robbed, sent back home naked as a warning, or traded for Oghuz hostages held by the Khagan in Itil. When finally convinced the Muslim caravan was on a mission to undermine the Khazars rather than seek an alliance with them, The Turks let it proceed peacefully on its way, foreshadowing the outright Oghuz aggression that would help herald the Khaganate's end in a few decades. While the period of dissolution and decline the Caliphate similarly faced meant no further invasions across the Caucasus would be coming, the Caliphate's diplomatic mission and funding to the Volga Bulgars would play a major role in the Khazars' downfall. Ibn Fadlan was disdainful of the Bulgars' practices during his visit, with the rather xenophobic traveller complaining at length about every slip or slight in the new converts' religious practices and of their comparatively open sexual practices and gender roles compared to his native Baghdad. However, he was successful in his mission to bring the Volga Bulgars solidly into the Muslim fold, while the Arab-funded fortress diminished the authority the Khazar Khagan could exert over his Bulgar vassals. In the following year, Muslim merchants would favour the trade routes into the lands of their Bulgar co-religionists, which, combined with the simultaneous disruptions of trade by the Oghuz to the east and the Rus to the west, and the loss of tribute from so many Slavic tribes now under Kiev's overlordship, caused Itil's vital trade revenues to plummet drastically and reduced the state's ability to field and equip its armies. Simultaneously, the reign of Romanos Lekopenos in Constantinople and his aggressive persecution of Jews in Byzantium marked the final breakdown of the Byzantine-Khazar alliance, with direct clashes between Khazar and Byzantine forces occurring in Crimea during the 920s, and further Byzantine outreach to the Pechenegs and Rus following. The 940s would bring this odd, tense Cold War to a head on multiple fronts. After occasional smaller-scale conflicts over the previous years, 941 saw a large-scale attack by the Rus on the Khazars aimed at overthrowing their suzerainty. It proved a failure, with a Khazar general named Pesek driving them back, but it would be a short reprieve for the increasingly embattled Khazar state. The brief victory against the Rus was followed by renewed Pecheneg, Oghuz and Alan attacks, ostensibly funded and spurred on by Byzantium. While this accusation stems from an anonymous letter and cannot be fully verified, it is lent credibility by passages in Emperor Constantine VII's book on imperial administration that advises future emperors to make war on the Khazars via Alan and Oghuz proxies. The Caliphate, meanwhile, was crumbling in its own right. In the 930s, a Zoroastrian ruler by the name of Mardajiv had briefly seized control of Tabaristan and northern Persia, putting Baghdad and the Caliph himself under threat. While Mardajiv would be assassinated in 935, the power vacuum would be filled not by a resurgent caliphate, but by the Shia Muslim Buyid dynasty, which rapidly expanded from Fars to eclipse the Caliph in Baghdad as the dominant Muslim power, reducing the Caliph to a vassal in 945, while independent Muslim rulers in what is modern Azerbaijan continued to clash with the Khazars. However, the figure whose name would loom largest during the fall of the Khazars would be the warlike Kievan ruler Sviatoslav. In the same year as the Caliph's subjugation to the Buyids, Saint Olga was taking the throne in Kiev as regent to her young son Sviatoslav, following her husband Igor's murder. Olga's time as acting ruler of Kiev would be as blood-soaked as her son's coming reign of conquest, with revenge at the front of her mind. Igor had beaten the East Slavic Drevlian people in battle, only to die at Drevlian hands while recklessly travelling to their lands under light guard to demand increased tribute. The Drevlians attempted to push what they saw as an advantage over the Kievan Rus, now ruled by a child and a woman, demanding tribute and Olga's hand in marriage. Demands Olga would answer in a poetically brutal manner. While feigning fealty and surrender, she buried one group of Drevlian diplomats alive, lured a party of their nobility into a bathhouse she would bar the doors of and set ablaze, and slaughtered Drevlian warriors in their hundreds after letting them grow drunk on mead at a feast in her dead husband's honour. Her vendetta ended with the Drevlian capital of Iskorosten burned to ashes, its people killed or enslaved, and the Drevlian tribal confederation broken up and assimilated into the Kievan Rus, its name all but dropping from the annals of history. This campaign would only be a taste of what her son Sviatoslav had in store for Europe and the steppes, however. One of the most famous accounts of the Khazars, and one of the very few surviving documents of Khazar origin, dates from this period. This document is a correspondence between the Khazar ruler Joseph ben Aron and Hastai ibn Shaprut, an accomplished Jewish scholar and doctor who served as an important minister to the Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba. Dating to the late 950s or 960, Joseph's reply to Hasdai provides a valuable account of the conversion of the Khazar nobility to Judaism, but its account of the contemporary political situation is questionable, describing only a history of unbroken Khazar victories and claiming continued mastery over the peoples of the steppes, less than a decade before his kingdom's final collapse. After the end of his regency in 962, Sviatoslav would soon provide the final hammer blow, reaching out to the Oghuz for an alliance to crush the Khazars in a vice between them. Sakel, a Khazar fortress that had long held the Rus at bay, fell in 965, and the Khazar state began to swiftly crumble in a two-front war. Previously, superior Khazar cavalry had given them the edge against the Rus, an advantage lessened by the presence of Oghuz and Pecheneg mercenaries accompanying Sviatoslav's army, providing him with skilled nomadic horsemen to match his foes. Though the conquest would take 4 years, Khazar central authority seems to have broken down quickly, with the Khagans' inability to keep the encroaching Oghuz at bay in the east, sparing most of the settled subjects of Khazaria to petition the Sassanids for aid instead, and most of the people of Khazaria soon adopted Islam in exchange for Persian intervention to keep the Turks at bay. In the west, there was no ally or patron to appeal to, as many of the Khazars' remaining vassals and tributaries had already been convinced by Sviatoslav to join the Rus without resistance prior to his invasion. Itil's fall in 969 marked the end of the Khazar Khaganate, and while the Pechenegs and Volga Bulgars would remain powerful contenders in its former territory, the Kievan Rus had positioned themselves as the clearly dominant successor to their once mighty empire. The centuries of Khazar rule had helped shape Europe's history in numerous ways. It was in part their influence that shaped the emergence of the earliest principalities to use the name Rus, and their violent rise to power in the steppes that spurred Bulgar and Magyar migration into what would become Bulgaria and Hungary. The Khazars' downfall would have similar reverberations. Of the victorious allies, the Kievan Rus would expand rapidly into former Khazar territory and westwards against the First Bulgarian Empire, joining the Oghuz again in 985 for a joint attack on the Volga Bulgars, before soon turning on and subjugating those Oghuz tribes that remained in the formerly Khazar steppes as their relentless push east continued. Though another mighty nomadic nation, the Mongols, would bring an end to the Kievan Empire Sviatoslav had ruled, from this foundation, Muscovy and later Russia would grow to span Eurasia as one of the world's largest empires. The Oghuz, meanwhile, would splinter with the threat of the Khazars gone, but one of these offshoots, the Seljuks, would soon forge an empire spanning Persia. More videos on Islamic and nomadic histories are on the way. To make sure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.